Hello, friends. This is Dave Hurwitz, executive editor at ClassicsToday.com, here with 5 famous conductors' most annoying mannerisms. Now, one of the fascinating things about this particular topic, and one of the reasons I wanted to talk to you about it, is because it's often the case that an artist's strengths can also be that same artist's weaknesses. Weaknesses. That's the word, isn't it? Yeah. Why? Because, anything carried to excess can get irritating, number one. And number two, because, one of the things that we revere about great artists and great conductors is that they personalize. They personalize interpretations. You can often tell who's conducting without even knowing the name of the conductor, at least in some instances, just by what they're doing to the music. But what they're doing to the music sometimes works depending on the repertoire, or depending on the day, or how they feel, or how extreme what they do gets. And that's where the idea of mannerism comes in, a nervous tick, something that distorts or distends the music in an unpleasant way, and that occurs on a regular basis because it's part of their musical physiognomy. It's part of their personality. So let's just run down the list, and we're talking in gross generalities here. You really have to make a decision based on individual performances of individual works. But with these really big ego, positive, sort of larger than life characters, you can often tell there are certain patterns. So let's start with the good old Wilhelm Furtwängler, Forty, whatever his name is. Furtwängler had a couple mannerisms, but most was that it all began with his technique, about which he was extremely defensive. He was a very insecure person. His technique basically consisted of giving a sort of a downbeat and doing this for a while, and then sort of going into an epileptic seizure with the baton. It would just start to jiggle and wiggle like this, and that was conducting. And for him, he tried to make a positive out of the fact that he had just a terrible technique in terms of keeping orchestras together and doing sort of the basic rudimentary things conductors are supposed to do. He usually managed to work with orchestras who knew the repertoire as well as he did, and so he could focus on shaping the larger picture, which was where his strength was. He had a wonderful conception of works as organic wholes. That was his whole life. That we wrote about it. It was wholeness. He wanted wholeness. He wanted wholeness and this sort of organic unfolding. And he had an amazing sense of where the climaxes were, and he would let them just explode. He could be cosmically fabulous when everything came together, which it very seldom did, at least on evidence of the recordings, because his mannerism was not caring about ensemble. He cared about sound. He cared about sonority. He liked big, beefy bass lines, for example. But in real time, he was kind of helpless, holding things together. And oh my goodness. For example, the opening of Beethoven's Fifth Symphony, it could have, da-da-da-da, right? Not so difficult. The opening of Beethoven's Fifth could have anywhere from 3 to 6 notes, depending on where everyone thought his downbeat showed up. Things like that. It really was kind of amazing. And he needed to have a genuine collaboration with his orchestral musicians who understood what his concept was, because otherwise all hell would break loose. It could be just a disaster. So he definitely had his mannerisms, and they were most evident in really slipshod ensemble and slackening of tension. That was Furtwängler. On the opposite end was, of course, Toscanini. Now, Toscanini almost never had issues of ensemble discipline. He had the opposite issue. He could straitjacket an orchestra so tightly, rhythmically, not necessarily playing fast. It was his approach to rhythm. His approach to rhythm could be brutal, slash and burn rhythm, wasn't always, of course not. Same thing with Furtwängler. It wasn't always falling apart. But Toscanini's sense of discipline, particularly as he got older, started to veer into the direction of a certain rigidity that made the music sound very choppy, particularly in the dry acoustic of RCA's Studio 8H, where the sort of brutality of the rhythm could be very, very painful in music that had strongly marked rhythms anyway, and that needed a certain flexibility of pulse, the ability to breathe. I mean, Toscanini could breathe with the best of them. He had great lungs. He breathed very, very well. He really did. But he had this tendency sometimes, and it was also perhaps a function of his own, all these egomaniacal conductors. I'm giving you a secret here. They're terribly insecure people, and their mannerisms manifest themselves in that insecurity. With Furtwängler, it could be a fabulous climax, and then all hell breaks loose. All around the rest of it, it's a mess. With Toscanini, it could be that he started to get more and more regimented in his handling of rhythm, and that stiffness could be very, very unpleasant. It really could. But again, you'll have to find the places where that happens, where you think it's an issue, because all of these comments, these generalizations, are in a sense exaggerations too, because you can apply them. And people do, because all these conductors have their detractors. You could say, well, Toscanini's rhythm was butchery. I mean, that's what Furtwängler said. Or you could say Furtwängler was a gross, horrible slob. That's what I said and other people. And they were probably better more often than we sometimes give them credit for being, because they were distinctive. And if you hate the thing that made them distinctive, then they were awful all the time. If you're a little bit more relaxed about it, then they were pretty good most of the time, and they had some bad spots. That's the approach I really feel is the fair one. I mean, it really is, because these people did not get their acclaim and reputation by being sucky most of the time. Let's be honest, right? So that's Toscanini. It's rigidity. Leonard Bernstein. Now, Bernstein, I think, is probably the most misunderstood great conductor of the entire 20th century. And I see it all the time in comments, in the comments that people leave on this channel, because they all say the same thing. Bernstein was this sort of wanton, narcissistic, emotional baby who just sort of let it all hang out all over the place in his interpretations. That is so not true. That is completely the opposite of what Bernstein really did, especially when they talk about things like his Mahler, where everyone says, well, it's so emotional. Even Dochnani, the conductor, said Bernstein, cheapened Mahler. He made it, shtick and schmaltz and all of that stuff. And it's just totally, totally untrue. Bernstein was one of the most faithful interpreters you will ever encounter if you actually follow a score and see what he does. The problem with Bernstein was that he could become pedantic because he was a teacher. He was a born teacher. People said about him he could have been a rabbi. He was designed to preach the gospel of music and teach it to all of us. He had a mission to do that. And the result of that was that he made his points too strongly. That's not emotional excess. That's actually, like I said, it's a didacticism, a pedanticism, where he would start to just say, this is the important part, so I'm going to emphasize this, sometimes ridiculously. It happened, for example, in that famous Tchaikovsky Sixth that I love, where I think it works. It works beautifully with that excruciatingly slow finale, where he's trying to find a structural parallel to the big, long, sort of out of proportion first movement. It makes sense what he does if you accept the premise. But where it doesn't work is the excruciatingly slow Largo of Dvorak's New World Symphony. Or, for example, the Sibelius Second, where he's just stretching these things out. And he's making points, is what he's doing. It's not because he's emotionally out of control, or because he's just wallowing in emotional excess. It's nothing like that. And his Mahler is more faithful to both the letter and the spirit of what Mahler wanted to do than virtually anybody else's. And that's a fact. That you can prove. That's not all of this business about how Bernstein is just excessive is kind of nonsense. He can be excessive in certain ways, but you have to understand the underlying motivation. And so with Bernstein, you don't want to get into a situation where he feels he needs to teach us something rather than simply let the music do what the music wants to do. Sometimes his point making got to be a little bit, but most of the time it was okay. He was all right. And he could make his points without destroying the music he was trying to make the point about. So after Bernstein, what have we got? Oh, Solti. Goodness gracious. I think Solti was one of the most puzzling characters in all of music as a conductor, because in fast music, he could be completely brutal. He was really best as a conductor in the theater. He was a wonderful operatic conductor because he was exciting. He had this dramatic sense that was very, very keenly honed. But as a symphonic conductor, he used to be sort of quick and brutal, but at the same time insensitive to detail, and lacking in a kind of enjoyment of incident. Conductors need to be able to point out some of the nice things that they're doing, but Solti would just sort of like railroad his way right through it. But then in slow music, he could just let the tension dissipate entirely. I think he felt that to compensate for the sort of quick, fast, but shallow approach in fast music, he wanted to have very slow, very spiritual, slow movements. You hear this in his Bruckner, some of which is marvelous, but he does these adagios. My God, they're unbelievable, minutes longer than anybody else. Even in his Brahms cycle, which is one of the very best things he ever did, he risks, but doesn't go over the line, in making the slow movements sound a little bit too slow, because he seemed not. I don't know if he lost interest or if he just didn't know how to create the kind of tension, the spark that ran through his handling of fast music. It's an interesting question. He also, by the way, was almost completely insensitive to recorded sound, to sonic considerations. The evidence of that is just the sound of his recordings. His digital recordings, the recordings in Chicago, even with the LSO in his earlier period, he just didn't seem to take much interest. We read, for example, in John Culshaw's book, Ring Resounding, how they spent so much time working on the sound in that recording of Wagner's Ring and all that. There he seemed to care a lot. But for some reason, he never got really great recorded sound from his labels. That's true of a lot of people. Furtwängler, of course, hated recording, generally speaking, largely because he had to hear what he did. He would be horrified at the result. Toscanini gradually, sort of, when sonic recording became good enough to do some justice to what he was trying to achieve, reconciled himself to it. Bernstein had no problem with recordings whatsoever, although he chose to do live recordings later in his career and have patch-up sessions later. Solti was a recording artist par excellence. He loved making recordings. He made tons of recordings. He was the Grammy champion, the all-time Grammy champion, largely because Naris had sort of stacked the deck with its Chicago chapter and made sure that whatever he did in Chicago won a Grammy. But Solti had no problem making records. There's no difference between Solti live and Solti on disc. I mean, I heard him live many times. I heard him on disc many times. It's the same thing. Kind of fast, brutal, quick movements and very slow, kind of saggy, slow movements when he wasn't on. Again, I have to keep saying, these generalizations are just that, generalizations. But that was Solti. And last but not least, of course, what discussion of this would not be, possible without talking about Herbie, Herbert von Karajan, whose nickname apparently was Fluffy. That's what his wife called him or something like that. Anyway, Karajan was famous for the Karajan sound, just like Roger Norrington had the Norrington sound. Of course, I can't talk about famous conductors' most annoying mannerisms because Norrington's style is nothing but annoying mannerisms, whereas Karajan could be amazing, absolutely amazing, especially in the music that he really, really felt strongly about, like Tchaikovsky, for example, the Russians. The German standard repertoire, a little bit less so. Why? Because Karajan's mannerisms were he hated woodwinds, he hated vocalists, he was a voice wrecker, he hated choirs. Oh my goodness. Because Karajan was a control freak whose entire being rested on creating the richest possible string sonority. And he did. The Berlin strings under Karajan were a thing of wonder. They were glorious, and they could make a sound that was absolutely astonishing. And one absolutely typical recording of his pluses and minuses in that regard was the coupling of Bartók's music for strings, percussion, and celesta, and Stravinsky's Apollo. If that was ever, I think they were coupled. And if they weren't, they should have been, frankly, because the Bartók had a string sound, the density and power of which was absolutely extraordinary. But Apollo, which is all strings and neoclassical, was the most gluey, oleaginous, disgusting performance you've ever heard in your life, because he wanted this extreme legato. He couldn't stand any kind of dryness, any kind of rhythmic, energy. He derived his energy through that intensity of tone and not through his handling of rhythm. He didn't like percussion. He didn't want, brass and woodwinds were sort of, sometimes when he let everybody cut loose, as for example in his Sibelius Finlandia, it was amazing. It was so raw, so edgy, so intense with all that fabulous string sound. But often as not, when he was in the Karajanization mode, he would allow the strings to simply run roughshod over everything else. As Schumann, for example, which is unlistenable. You wouldn't know that there's a wind section in that orchestra. In the tutti, in the big sections where you're still supposed to have a sense of, the instrumental choirs being in some kind of balance. No, that wasn't for him. So his mannerism was glutinous strings all over everything. But it's very interesting. It's interesting to think about these splendid artists and identify the things that when they were on made them fabulous and when they were off made them atrocious. And that's the story. So keep on listening, friends. Thanks so much for joining me. And if you have your own artist mannerisms you want to talk about, feel free to contribute. Take care.